Hey, Marty.
Hey, Aaron, how are you? Can you see your document?
Unmute yourself, Marty.
Oh, I'm mute. Oh, why am I muted? No, I'm unmuted. I should be unmuted. Uh, why am I not seeing everything? No, I'm unmuted, Aaron. It says
Can't hear you.
maybe you got a volume problem on is your volume turned up or something? Maybe you need to turn up volume.
All right. Volume up.
Okay, let's see. Does that work?
Yep.
Okay.
Oh,
Hi
is
there,
it-
then.
Not tonight because I may watch that movie. We'll catch up sometime next week.
Okay, works for
Bye-bye.
me. Bye-bye. Hi, Aaron. Hi, Martin.
Hi there.
Oh, I gotta move this so you can see me. I don't believe the time passed so fast, Martin. I just saw you and it seems like it was like.
It's true. Aaron, I've made you a co-host in case.
Okay.
Aaron, I wanted to tell you, I love the wall hangings in in your office or wherever it is you're working.
Suzanne, yes?
It's early yet.
Yeah, it is.
Oh yeah, we've got 7 minutes. We're the early birds, but you don't want the host to show up late, do you?
Really.
So are either of you going out at all these days?
I go to the supermarket early in the morning.
How about you, Aaron? Are you going out at all?
Rarely.
I'm going to my brother this evening to sit in his driveway, suitably distant, and drink something with him.
Hey, Gail.
Hi, Gail. Didn't mean to scare you.
I just turned on the audio. I heard my name.
I wish I could say, hello, Gail, you've won the lottery, but I can't do that for you.
Yeah, I wish somebody would say this whole thing is over.
Yeah, well, that's what I'd like, but it ain't going to happen. Not for quite a while, I'm
I
afraid.
think it's another year before we're more.
I agree with you, Marty.
Thinking. Yeah, it's really, but the thing is that we're in limbo. We have no idea how long this is going to last.
Well, we really don't understand that much about this virus. They keep learning things, and they're not terribly on top of how this virus operates.
No, they are not. At
Well,
least not in this country. I mean, there are vaccines that are they tell us are further along than normally all over the world. But even if they find them, they have to rev up manufacturing. And we've done things like this during World War II, but it's a different world now.
Well, imagine what it takes to create, soon they get a vaccine, to create billions of doses. How long does that take?
that's going to be, there are some efforts underway to create some infrastructure to do this.
Yeah.
But I don't know what that means, honestly.
And they've even got somebody from this country because Trump has basically decided the virus isn't there anymore.
No, well, I hope he gets it because
Yeah, well,
he was fully exposed last night. He could get it.
actually, anything I've read about last night, it was basically like it wasn't what he had hoped.
It was what?
It wasn't what he had hoped. There was
Oh.
fewer
No, it
people.
was crazy. It was Yeah, I mean, the place was pretty empty. I think they only filled about 30 to 35% of the place.
They
Yeah.
say that you got 6,200 people,
6,200 people, yeah.
which is nothing.
Yeah, and the latest Fox poll that came out today, he's really lost a lot of ground. He's in the 30s, and I think now the Republicans in Congress are probably in a panic.
Do you think he can make it up? Because I think he can. Whether it's legal or not is besides.
I don't know, but we can't keep we have to keep our guard up.
And the Democrats are going to have to start doing dirty. I don't know if Biden can do that, but Obama can. So we have to keep our guard up.
Biden doesn't have to say much. Trump says it all.
Thank
He's
God Biden doesn't have to say much because
he
he's been known.
advertises himself.
He's a loose cannon. I mean, every time he opens his mouth, he tells a lie. So, you know.
Yeah,
But his base doesn't see that. And if he can, not have a lot of people vote by mail, and if he can do some of the stuff that he does, I'm afraid he can pull it off, and it scares the shit out of me.
Suppression of the black vote has been a part of the Republican playbook for at least 80, 90, 100 years.
What did you say?
Suppression of the black vote has been in the Republican playbook for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
Of
Yeah.
course it has. Y'all keep believing that.
I do believe it.
I know.
It's the
Oh,
truth.
I do believe
Actually,
that.
I believe the truth.
Obvious.
I believe
I see.
Yeah. He's got to go. He's really got to go. One more term and our democracy is
This
finished.
country is gone in one more term. It's gone.
Yeah, no.
Well, part of the problem is he doesn't have a clue what this country is about.
Hey, guys, tell me one policy that Trump has passed that you don't like. One policy. Come on.
Oh, well,
Did you attempt to repeal DACA?
What?
He's
DACA.
he's
All
going
the
to
all the
win
gutting of environmental regulations that are important for health. Lots of stuff.
transgendered health care. That's an executive order.
Well, it's all executive orders.
How do you? It's so cruel. I mean, it's so cruel, and especially during a pandemic. But this is his way of dividing the nation. He's a divider.
Mm-hmm.
And he wants perfect loyalty from everyone.
Oh, he's crazy.
So a lot of very good
He's so
people
crazy.
have been fired.
What were the policies again? I didn't hear you.
Most of the immigration policies, most of the environmental policies,
Oh, God, the
tons
environmental
of it.
regulations.
Civil rights
The immigration? You mean the illegal immigration?
No, I'm talking
No,
about the legal.
legal immigration.
I'm talking
No. What did he do?
He tried
They pretty
to
much
dismantle
stopped
DACA.
doing
It's the most stupid, inhumane thing to do.
Those people ought to be citizens. They're really Americans. They don't know any other country but America, and they've done well.
I know. How many guys, how many times has Trump said to the Congress, make a law, make a law,
Hi,
make
Al.
a law, and they
Hi, hello,
Well,
I'm looking into this.
we don't want
Hey.
to. We're talking about Russian jury now, so we're moving to
Well,
Russian
let's
jury.
go to Russia.
Moving to Russia.
I love you guys anyway.
Steve, on another subject, how's your wife? I haven't seen her.
I'm sorry, what?
How's your wife? I haven't seen her in a long time.
I know. She's doing good. She's very much not wanting to get out, and we talked to Bootsy's doctor not long ago, and Bootsy is in good shape, no doubt about it, but the doctor said she's 92, she's got some issues, and really don't want to go out and bring anything back.
Tell her I said hello.
I will.
Hi, Dory.
Do you have her phone number, Suzanne?
I don't think so.
All right, well, I'll tell you what, I will look up your name in the directory and call you and give you her number. She loves to talk on the phone. She loves to get phone calls from people and to talk.
So guys, I'm going to mute everybody, and if you want to talk, then just unmute yourself. But I'm going to put everybody in mute for so that
Okay.
everyone can start speaking.
We wait.
Unmute yourself, Aaron.
Muted now.
Okay, you're good. Okay.
Well, first of all, hi, everybody. Happy Father's Day. We're going to talk about World War II in Russia and the Soviet Union. It's called the Great Patriotic War. In 1939, the Soviet Union took a census of their population. And the Jewish population at that time was slightly over 3 million. That's people who declare themselves Jews. Of that 3 million, 2.1 million lived in all parts of the Soviet Union that were captured by the Germans during the war. September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland. September 17th of the same, just 16 days later, the Red Army crosses the Polish border to ostensibly protect the lives and properties of West Belorussia and West Ukraine. There was, of course, a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Germany. But in that non-aggression pact was a secret clause that both governments signed that both countries were aware that after the Nazis invaded Poland, the Soviet Union was going to invade Poland from the east. Between 350,000 to 500,000 Jews served in the Soviet army during the war. This represented 18% of the Jews in the USSR. An estimated 200,000 fell in battle at the front. There were several initiatives by Jews in Russia to establish separate Jewish military formations, but that did not yield any results. I want to read to you a text from Yad Vashem's Jews in the Red Army, a project that Yad Vashem did after the war, chronicling the role of Russian Jews in the Red Army. This is about one particular soldier. His name was Evel Belovin. And he was born in 1920 in the town of Basarov, Belorussia. His father was a carpenter. And like his three elder brothers, Evel graduated from a Yiddish school. Then he worked as a locksmith, but he wanted to become a pilot. In 1935, he enrolled in courses at a local airfield. In 1938, he was drafted into the Red Army. A year later, he completed studies at a school for pilots where he specialized in bombing. Not embombing, but like the dropping of bombs. During the war, Evel served as a pilot in the Soviet forces, and he was involved in the battles of the Caucasus and Kursk. The Battle of Kursk, for those of you who maybe don't know, was the largest tank battle in the history of warfare up until 1967. Evel's three brothers also served in the Red Army. One of them, Roman, was also a pilot, while the other two, Boris and Yakov, fought in the infantry. In 1944, Evel's squadron was attacked by German jet planes. The plane of Evel's commander was hit and exposed to further German attack. Evel provided cover to the commander's plane with his own and returned the German fire. As a result, his own plane was badly damaged. He thought about parachuting out, but his gunner was severely wounded and could not jump. Against all odds, Evel succeeded in landing the plane. For this exploit, he was hero of the Soviet Union. Evel logged more than 300 combat flights, ending with the Battle for Berlin. In addition to being decorated as Hero of the Soviet Union, he was also awarded several other honors. And he retired from the Army as a career Army person with the rank of colonel. Now, it's also interesting that among the Soviet troops were a relatively large number of Jewish women. The majority of them were medics who evacuated the wounded from the battlefield or served in other units whose members were often in battle zones. The special category was composed of those women who participated directly in combat as pilots or navigators in the Soviet Air Force or in artillery units. Now, because so many Soviet men were called up to service and were killed or wounded, it's very interesting to note that the Soviet labor force at the height of the war consisted of 60% women. It's 60% of the entire Soviet labor force was female during the war. Now, after the Red Army crossed the Polish border and invaded Poland, Stalin went on record as telling the Red Army Chief Commissar that the Red Star, which was the army newspaper, Soviet army newspaper, like Stars and Stripes was in the United States, it still is, the Red Star makes frequent allusions to fascists and fascism. Stop doing that. There's no need for Hitler to get the impression that we were only planning a war against him. That's interesting on a lot of levels. For one thing, historians who study the war basically all agree that Stalin was not prepared and did not believe that Germany was going to eventually invade the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union issued a decree that citizenship would be granted to all citizens in Poland on the day of annexation. Acceptance of citizenship was voluntary. People could choose to hold on to their Polish citizenship. And it's interesting that quite a large number of Polish Jews, somewhere between 150 to 200,000, took Russian or Soviet citizenship. The Soviets arrested many people in the areas incorporated from Poland on charges of possible espionage, belonging to counter-revolutionary organizations, or for counter-revolutionary agitation. As many as 590,000 Polish citizens were estimated to be in the Soviet Union in 1941, 20% of them Jews. That number included Red Army conscripts, those who moved to the interior of Russia to work or escape the Nazis, but not those who were arrested. That number was estimated at 71,000. Now, as a general rule, the 21 months of Soviet rule in Poland was disillusioning experience for most Jews. Factories owned by the Jews were confiscated. Kehilot and all Zionist organizations were abolished. The entire Jewish education system was disbanded and replaced by Soviet state schools. All existing Jewish newspapers were banned, with the one exception, a new newspaper called the Bialystoker Stern. That was established to serve communist ideology. Simultaneously, there was an increase in anti-Semitism, especially in Poland and Lithuania.
You're fading out, Aaron.
Polish and Lithuanian nationalists exaggerated the Jewish. Thank you. Polish and Lithuanian nationalists exaggerated the Jewish participation in the new system. And it's interesting that any Jewish presence in the apparatus of government was considered to be an overturning of the national order in Poland and Lithuania. Because previously, until then, Jews had not been part of any of the ruling state apparatus in Poland or Lithuania.
Aaron,
Yes,
when the Russians took over Poland, their part of Poland, they executed every Polish army officer in their control to further their idea of basically integrating Poland into the Soviet Union.
not only army officers,
Yes,
but Polish intellectuals,
yeah, I was going to say that.
clerics, anyone who would they considered to be the Polish intelligentsia. Because basically what they considered to them to be class enemies. And we know from the last class what the Soviet Union did to class enemies. And there was a very famous massacre of Polish army officers at Katyn, I believe it was. Thousands of Polish army officers were rounded up and executed at one time. And of course, this was not made public for years and years because the Soviet Union charged the Nazis with that slaughter, with that massacre. And it wasn't until decades later that the truth finally came out. I believe, and I'm sorry that I don't have that, that I didn't look that up, that truth did not come out till the 1980s. Okay, let's go back to Operation Barbarossa. What was Operation Barbarossa? That was the code name for the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. It was authorized on December 18, 1940. Directive 21, issued by the High Command of the German Armed Forces, the OKW. The objective of Operation Barbarossa, to destroy the Soviet Union as a communist state, together with its Judeo-Bolshevist regime. So right from the very beginning, the Nazis linked the Jews to communism, to the invasion, and as part of the German Nazi racist ideology, there was no difference between Jews and Bolsheviks. And the Nazis had one aim in the end, to destroy the regime. And they considered the Russians, as well as the Poles for that matter, to be Slavic people who could not be rehabilitated in the new German order in the East. They would either be murdered or serve as slaves. Now, this is important because, for example, the Germans had a different outlook as to the Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians in the Baltics. Not that they considered them equal to the Germans, but they weren't Slavs, they would not become slaves, and they could serve some useful role in the new German order. As early as March 13th, 1941, the OKW authorized the Einsatzgruppen and other SS units to carry out operations against civilian populations
Oops, we're losing you.
under military control. At the onset of the occupation, German authorities forced the Jewish councils to collect large sums of money and pass that money on to them. Members of the council or other groups of Jews were arrested and held hostage to ensure successful collection of the levy. So one thing to understand is the German repression of the Jews in the areas that they were conquering happened in stages. The first stage was to get rid of all functioning Jewish authority, property, the Gehilot, and collect money from them. The second part was forced labor. The military administration ordered all Jewish males aged 14 to 60 and all Jewish females aged 16 to 50, they would be subject to forced labor. The ghettos were established simultaneously, and the beginning of the annihilation of the Jews began with the Einsatzgruppen mobile units going into places, rounding up the Jews, and executing them, mostly by shooting at that point. Now, as this was taking place, what was the reactions of the local population? We're talking about the...
They aided and abetted them.
Yes,
They couldn't have done it without the locals.
thank you, Gail, that's true, exactly. So the attitude was partly hostile, mostly indifferent. And the attitudes depended on the strength of anti-Semitism before the German invasion, which was widespread, particularly in the Baltic states. Also the power of nationalism, because initially, many locals saw the Germans as liberators from the Soviet occupation. But it's very interesting that the Nazis did not recognize this. There was an opportunity for the Nazis to win over large portions, especially non-Russians, in the Soviet Union at the beginning of the war. But the Germans had pre-scripted what they were going to do in the East and did not make any changes to that pre-planned program and missed an opportunity because certainly the Ukrainians, many of the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, would have gone over to the Nazi side. As far as property went, Jewish homes and property were appropriated by members of the local population. They hoped to avoid Jewish return after the war. The Jews received no organized help from local groups or local anti-German underground groups, only from individuals. And of course, this slowed down any Jewish partisan activity that might have happened. It's very easy to say, very easy to look back and say, why wasn't there more anti-German activity from the Jews, especially as the killings began Well, there were several reasons. One reason was lack of weapons. The Jews had no access to weapons, and even Jewish partisans who managed to acquire weapons and who came to Soviet partisan units often had the experience of the Soviet partisan units refusing to accept the Jewish fighters and even stealing weapons from the Jewish partisans. So,
Fading again, Aaron.
the Nazis had a policy of collective punishment. In the rare cases where Jews, or for that matter, other partisans, shot and killed German troops, the local population was held collectively as being part of this action. And the Germans would go out and kill at random Jews, Ukrainians, etc. I remember reading one account of Ukrainian partisans killing a German horse, an army horse, in a small village at the beginning of the war. The Germans rounded up a dozen Ukrainians who belonged to that village and executed them over that one horse. So the Nazis didn't mess around. I want to read a text to you from Vasily Grossman. Who is familiar with Vasily Grossman? He's a Russian Jewish writer, great Russian Jewish writer. He's a communist, and he was also a journalist with the Red Star, the army newspaper. He wrote several novels, one Life and Fate, and one Stalingrad, a 1,000-page book about the Battle of Stalingrad, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. The character who's talking in this part of the novel is based on the author's mother, who stayed behind in Berdichev, Ukraine, to look after a sick niece. She continued to stay there and work even after the Jews were confined to the ghetto in Berdichev. From the book, Vitya, I'm certain this letter will reach you, even though I'm now behind the German front line, behind the barbed wire of the Jewish ghetto. This morning I was reminded of what I'd forgotten during the years of the Soviet regime, that I was a Jew. Some Germans drove past on a lorry shouting out, Juden, kaput. I got a further reminder from some of my neighbors. The caretaker's wife was standing beneath my window and saying to the woman next door, well, that's the end of the Jews. Thank God for that. What could make her say that? Her son's married to a Jew. The woman next door came around and said to me, Anna Semyovna, I'm moving into your room. Can you clear your things up by evening? I'll move into your room then. When I came back, I found the door of my room had been smashed in and all my things piled in the little room behind the kitchen. The neighbor said, I've kept the settee for myself. There's no room for it where you are now. So I include this particular text from the novel because it shows you the attitude of the Ukrainians towards the Jews. And it's interesting that Grossman was able to write this and publish this in the Soviet Union. Notice 2 or 3 things. First of all, the Germans had just basically arrived, and the Ukrainians were already divvying up the property of the Ukrainian Jews. Secondly, the woman next door saying, well, that's the end of the Jews. Thank God for that. So among the Ukrainians was either the realization of the hope that it was going to mean mass murder and displacement of the Jews in that part of the Soviet Union. Now, Jewish armed resistance in the ghettos did not come until late. Basically, the idea of fighting came as a result of the awareness that the Nazis had sentenced the Jews to total annihilation, and it was better to die fighting. It was hoped that a ghetto uprising would open the way for an escape to the forest to take up guerrilla warfare. And there were undergrounds organized in Minsk, Vilna, Kaunas, and the Riga ghettos. Let's talk about Jewish partisans. In Latvia and Lithuania, the locals were so hostile that they prevented all Soviet partisans from establishing strongholds in the forest. The Jews all the more so. Now, as I said, some Soviet partisans were unwilling to accept Jewish young people in their ranks, but there were Jewish partisan units formed, including one that liberated the Kosovo ghetto in August 1942. On the whole, Jewish armed resistance in the forests and in the ghettos was active on a much wider scale than anywhere else in Europe. Let's look at the text by Yitzhak Arad, who was one of the great historians of the Holocaust. In his book, The Holocaust in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union followed a deliberate propaganda policy dictated by Stalin. That was obvious from his very first wartime speech. And this is Stalin. The Nazi German aim was to annihilate the Russians and other Slavic people. And that wasn't true. Stalin hid the fact that Nazi Germany carried out total annihilation only of the Jews and not of any other nation in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. In millions of leaflets distributed along the Soviet front and in the rear area, the German propaganda machine stressed that its war was against Judeo-Bolshevism and not against the Russian people and the other nations in the Soviet Union. Now, to counter this propaganda, Soviet authorities presented Germany as striving to exterminate the Russians and other Slavic nations, while at the same time downplaying the murder of Jews and their singular fate under German occupation. So we have from the highest echelons of the Soviet government a downplay of what the Nazis were doing and meant to do to the Jewish people. Basically, the position of Stalin was that anything that did not contribute directly to the war effort, to the victory over Nazi Germany, was of no interest to him. What other government leader do we know who basically said the same thing? That if it did not contribute to the victory over Nazi Germany, there was no interest to him in the war.
Roosevelt.
Who?
Roosevelt.
Roosevelt. And who else?
Churchill.
Exactly. Both Roosevelt and Churchill said the same thing as Stalin. And we know that FDR was approached later in the war and asked to bomb the railroad tracks leading to Auschwitz. But once again, he refused because that would draw American planes and bombs away from winning the war against the Nazis.
That also happened with the British. A British unit said they were going, because they were bombing the oil fields in Romania, and
Right.
said they would bomb the area around Auschwitz, and Churchill told them no.
Exactly. Now, the turning point in the war was after the battle.
Stalingrad.
Stalingrad.
Which is basically, the Battle of Stalingrad. 1943 was a turning point in the war. And after the Battle of Stalingrad, a wave of Stalinist terror was unleashed. Why and against who? As Soviet armies began to push westward and began to liberate territory that had been ruled by the Nazis, Stalin thought that these areas needed to be cleansed of the taint of occupation. He looked at it this way. Many of the people there had been forced to collaborate or had collaborated with the Nazis out of conviction. Others had evaded recruitment into the Red Army. Also, in some areas, the Germans had allowed the people a high level of autonomy during their brief rule. So Stalin felt that these areas and the people who lived in them were tainted. And in order to wipe away this taint, mass repression was needed, based on the idea of collective responsibility for collaboration with the occupiers. So it wasn't just the Nazis who believed in collective responsibility for collaboration. It was Stalin also. Now there were, between 1943 and 44, Stalin unleashed this terror. And what did that actually mean in numbers and against who? There were as many as 1.4 million ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union, mostly in the Autonomous Republic of the Volga Germans. As many as 1.2 million of these Germans who lived in the Soviet Union were deported. Whole numbers of Soviet ethnic groups were deported from their autonomous republics. The Chechens and the Ingush, 500,000 of them were deported. The Crimean Tatars, 191,000 of them were deported. The Kalmuks, all Bulgarians, Greeks, and Armenians living in Crimea, a total of over 1 million people. Jewish losses were between 1 and 1.3 million in the Soviet Union. In the Baltics, about 90% of the Jewish population were murdered or were killed or died for other reasons. In Belarusia, about 66% of the Jewish population. In the Ukraine, about 60% of the Jewish population. And in Russia proper, about 100,000 Jews. Now, it's also interesting, this is before the end of the war. When Jews attempted to return, especially in the Ukraine, when they attempted to return and reclaim their apartments or property, There were anti-Jewish disturbances and individual attacks and even organized pogroms in the Ukraine. And the situation before and at the end of the war was so bad, the anti-Semitism was so bad in the Ukraine that Nikita Khrushchev, who was the head of the Communist Party of the Ukraine, put together a committee to find out what was happening on the ground
Oops, we lost you.
and to ameliorate the anti-Semitism in the Ukraine. Any questions?
Oh, okay.
Aaron, what was the name of that book again? The novel? The Grossman?
Life and Fate.
Life
Life
and Fate. Okay.
and Fate, F-A-T-E.
Have you watched the PBS show that's finished for this season, World on Fire?
No.
Okay, because there's a lot of scenes in Poland, because one of the characters tries to get his Polish girlfriend out, though he sends his sister, her little brother out to England instead. So he ends up back there with the partisans eventually. It's a good show. It goes back and forth. Also handled the in France when the Nazis come in, the condition, what they did to the children who were disabled.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, that happened before the war began, too.
yeah.
in Germany.
So it was because there's an American reporter reporting on all this
Yeah.
in Poland, and she goes to Warsaw. So it's an interesting show. It's not Jewish lean, but it's an interesting show.
So one of the things that becomes apparent is that as far as Eastern Europe goes, that the Jews in the Soviet Union, in Russia proper, fared much better in terms of survival than the Jews in the Baltics, in the Ukraine, in Belarusia, in Poland, in Romania, and in much of Western Europe. And we're going to see how that plays out in the next class, in the post-war period, in the 1940s and 1950s.
Aaron, how far into Russia proper did the Nazis get? You said there's a big battle in Stalingrad.
To the
man.
outskirts of Stalingrad.
Yeah, the outskirts of Stalingrad. I forget the name of the river. Stalingrad is on a major river.
Oh.
And the Germans were on
The Volga River.
No, that's where Moscow is on the Volga River.
Yeah, I believe Joyce, you're right. Moscow is Volga's in Moscow. I forget the name of the river that Stalingrad's on. But the German armies were on the west bank of the river. What is it?
Hey, Aaron, it's at one point you mentioned that the Jewish partisans liberated the Kosovo ghetto. Are you talking, is that the same Kosovo that's in Serbia?
No,
That's a different one.
Yeah.
This is in
this is in the
Okay.
Ukraine.
Okay.
Yeah, not,
I was wondering.
yeah, right. But anyhow, in Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army was on the west bank of that river.
It is the Volga.
It is the Volga, I'm sorry, yeah.
Look it up in
Yeah.
Wikipedia. It is the Volga.
Yeah.
The German Sixth Army was on the west bank of the Volga, and the east bank was the major part of the city. And they held out for about a year and a half. They were under siege, and it
No
was
food,
no food. They were
terrible.
eating animals, rats, horses, each other. shoe leather. The Vasily Grossman novel about Stalingrad really captures the horrors of that siege. If you have the stomach to read it,
Mm.
Like I said, it's about a 1,000-page book. Any other questions?
I've opened it up for anybody to unmute themselves.
Okay.
There's also a book of the 900 Days about the siege of Leningrad. You know, horrible what the people endured during that.
You know, as a Jew, I'm concerned with Jewish death and Jewish loss in that period of time. But there's one thing to note. In the area that comprised the Soviet Union before the war, an estimated 26 million Soviet citizens and soldiers perished
Yeah.
Wow.
during that war. 26
6
million.
million.
And was that the largest number? In
Oh, yeah.
any
Yes.
political-
Yes.
Yes. So it was a tumultuous period. And we're going to find out what happened after the Soviet Union came out of the war and what happened with the Soviet Jews during the period of the late 1940s and 1950s in the next class. Happy
Eric,
Father's Day,
did
everyone.
you go into the Baltic republics?
Just very little. Remember, 90% of the Jewish population was annihilated.
But when did the Nazis take over Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia? About what year? 42, 43? When was it?
41.
41?
41, well,
Yeah. It was conquered soon as the Nazis attacked. They conquered the Baltics
Okay.
right away.
It was June
That
of,
was early as September 1939, really.
no.
No, that was when
After 41, after
it was
Operation
41.
June of 41, they came in.
June of
Yeah.
41.
And
Yeah.
that whole summer, they were on a campaign to exterminate via, mostly shooting, all the Jews in that region. And they did it between, not that summer, the summer after, summer of 1942. They eradicated all the Jews in that region.
Wow. Wow.
I think I read somewhere that the Lithuanians and others, when they went in, so they would not necessarily harm the Jews in their own town, but they go to the next town over. The Nazis work over there.
I'm not sure how accurate that is.
That's what I read somewhere, I think.
Yeah, maybe.
Where's Baba Yar?
In the Ukraine.
In Ukraine, okay.
My
Okay,
father's half brother was in, the Nazis invaded the small town on Yom Kippur and tried to kill everybody that was in shul. And he played dead. They didn't realize they had not killed him, and he snuck into and joined the Red Army. So it was probably
That was one of the safest places.
September, October of 1941.
And Martin, who was that?
My father's half brother.
Yeah, to join the Red Army was probably the safest.
That's what he did. He snuck
Yeah.
in the woods, and then he ultimately joined the Red Army.
Right.
And they were very proud of their service in the Red Army.
Oh, definitely.
Right, yeah. After in the 80s when I visited, they would wear their uniforms with their medals and they loved Mother Russia. That's the way they were brought up.
Yeah.
Yeah, my father had a cousin who lived in South Africa as well, who had a brother who was still in Russia. And he was a fairly senior officer in the Red Army, had no interest in leaving Russia. None whatsoever.
Yeah, that's for sure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Aaron.
Next same time, same place, right?
Happy
Same time,
Father's
same
Day
place.
to everybody. It has
Okay.
kids.
Happy
Thanks,
Father's
Aaron.
Day.
Bye-bye.
Father's Day.
So my father told us